Senator John Cornyn listed concerns he said are facing Texans on the Senate floor Tuesday. The Texas Republican blamed what he described as unnecessary spending in Washington as putting, quote, inflationary pressures on almost everything from gasoline to groceries to housing. Cornyn also took a shot at President Biden's southern border policies. As the midterms approach, Republicans are seeking to make the border and illegal immigration a key pillar of their messaging, as millions of undocumented immigrants have entered the country since President Biden took office. The drug trade that has occurred has been a major issue as well, with fentanyl deaths skyrocketing in the U.S. into the high tens of thousands.
Mr. President, here we are back in the nation's capital after having the opportunity to spend a few weeks back home. And while it's still hot in Texas this time of year, so it's nice to get a little bit of respite back here, we certainly have a lot of work cut out for us. But it's always helpful to me to sort of compare what people are focused on here in Washington, D.C. with what folks back home care about the most. It's actually the best way to get some feedback on how we can do our jobs more effectively representing the people we represent. In my case, the 29 million people that call Texas home. People are not shy about expressing their views on what we've done and even offering some input on things that we are considering doing. For example, in Corpus Christi on the Gulf Coast of Texas, I spoke with industry at the port of Corpus Christi about the untapped potential of hydrogen energy. In Round Rock, which is just outside of Austin, I sat down with a number of sexual assault survivors, prosecutors, and medical professionals to talk about the need to train more sexual assault nurse examiners, which is a highly specialized form of nursing, to make sure that not only people who are sexually assaulted are compassionately cared for, but also that the evidence that's necessary to convict their assailant is collected in a way that's admissible in court. In Austin, I met with the Texas Association of Counties. We have 254 counties in Texas. Some of them, like Loving County, has more cattle than people, but it's great to meet or to be able to connect with all the elected representatives at the local level of our counties in one place, but to hear what's on their mind, and certainly everything from broadband development, deployment, particularly in the rural parts of our state, and disaster relief for places like Dallas, which experienced 13 inches of rain on one day and massive flooding. In the Rio Grande Valley, close to the border in Pharr, Texas, that's P-H-A-R-R, I got a chance to see how their local police department is partnering with local mental health providers to respond to individuals who commit offenses, maybe because they are going through a mental health crisis, how to train the officers to address those in a way that don't escalate that crisis and potentially cause harm to them as well as the individual that is causing or is experiencing that crisis. But it really is impressive to see a relatively small town like Pharr, Texas, really leading the way when it comes to compassionate and effective policing and providing our law enforcement officials, who are not necessarily trained mental health workers, the additional resources and training they need in order to respond effectively to those situations. Those are just a few examples of the sorts of folks I got to catch up with over the last few weeks, and I'm obviously always grateful for those who share their input and ideas with me. Those conversations and that input is vital to our work here in the Senate because they shed light on the problems our neighbors and our communities are facing, which isn't necessarily the coin of the realm here in Washington, D.C., where politics and spin infuses everything. For example, folks were almost universally, particularly small business folks, told me about the strain of a labor shortage on their businesses. If you go to a restaurant in Texas, That may be they're only operating on fewer hours or fewer tables because they frankly can't get this workforce they need to come back and to help work at those places. They obviously all very concerned about the impact of the spending that we've been doing here in Washington, D.C., some necessary, some unnecessary, in my opinion, and its impact on inflation and on family budgets, where they've seen their standard of living reduced because of this inflationary pressures on almost everything from gasoline to groceries to housing, you name it. They're also very concerned about high energy prices. I know there's been some talk about the reduction in price of gasoline. That's primarily a feature of reduced demand because, frankly, people have to make choices about how to spend the money they would ordinarily put in the tank and how to do it selectively, whether to go on a family vacation or to stay at home. It certainly hasn't been because of any increase in supply as a result of our domestic energy policies by the Biden administration. And then I heard a lot about people's concern about crime, and particularly the fentanyl crisis that we're experiencing here in America. 108,000 Americans died of drug overdoses last year alone. About 60% of those were from synthetic opioids, the fentanyl, the precursors of which are usually come from Asia, mainly China, to Mexico and then across the southern border. And then, of course, the ongoing Biden border crisis as a result of the open border policies of the Biden administration. 2.3 million migrants have been encountered along the border just since President Biden has taken office because of the catch and release policies associated with asylum seekers. Even those people who ultimately will not be able to qualify for asylum, which is roughly 85 to 90% of the people who claim it, will have melted into the great American landscape, maybe given a notice to appear for a future court hearing, but because of the backlog of immigration cases at immigration courts, we're talking years down the line. But these are just some of the things that I'm hearing from my constituents about. And these are chronic problems that, frankly, they do not see an appropriate and adequate response coming from Washington to address the very real impact on their everyday lives. What they can afford to buy at the grocery store, how safe their communities are, whether they feel safe walking around their neighborhood or sending their children out to play, whether the family will travel to see relatives for the holidays or whether they'll have to stay home in order to save money to put food on the table. Those are not the problems that our Democratic colleagues or the majority here in the Senate seems to be focused on like a laser. When I travel to Texas from Washington, it often feels like I'm visiting a parallel universe. You get here and things don't seem that odd at first, but the scenery is different, but the same problems Texans talk about are on display. You read headlines about the border crisis. You see that the mayor of Washington, D.C. is complaining and claiming a humanitarian crisis because although it claims to be a sanctuary city, when Governor Abbott or Governor Ducey from Arizona provide transportation to these sanctuary cities, all of a sudden the border crisis that we've been living with for a year and a half now seems very real. It's nice to see some folks in other parts of the country experiencing what my constituents in border communities have been experiencing for a long time now, together with the additional expense associated with things like deploying the National Guard to back up the Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection, all at Texas taxpayer expense, something that is uniquely a federal responsibility. But when the Biden administration refuses to do its job, it falls to people who live in those communities along the border and in those states to try to do the best they can. Despite the fact that our Democratic colleagues are reading the same headlines about crime, drug overdoses, inflation, and the border, despite the headlines here reflecting those concerns, our colleagues here in the Senate and in the White House have chosen to ignore them pretty much altogether. Our friends across the aisle have controlled the Senate now for a year and a half, as well as the House and the White House. They have the power to set any agenda that they see fit. They don't have to ask our permission or consent. And they certainly had every opportunity to do so. But what I've noticed, and what my constituents have commented on frequently, is this parallel universe in Washington, D.C., where Democrats aren't using the power that they have to address the problems that working families are facing. They've chosen to focus on a completely different set of issues. For example, let's look at the recent reckless tax and spending bill. Our Democratic colleagues, although we have worked together constructively on bipartisan legislation, in this case decided to pass a partisan bill to spend $740 billion strictly along partisan lines. But all this money and the tax increases that go along with it won't address the biggest problems families are facing anytime soon, certainly. In fact, it's likely to make the problems even worse. At a time when many people are struggling to pay for gasoline for their cars, our Democratic colleagues decided to give well-to-do people who can afford $80,000 electric vehicles a taxpayer handout of about $7,500 at the expense of the working families who can't afford to buy an electric vehicle of their own at any price. This ensures that gas prices will climb even higher by reviving, this bill will revive the old Superfund tax on American energy production. It'll guarantee families will face higher electricity prices this winter by slapping a new methane tax on energy producers. And that's all just the climate portion of the reckless tax and spending bill. Our colleagues decided that it was the smart thing to do to supersize the Internal Revenue Service and giving it even more manpower to invariably audit middle-class America and small businesses. And then they've doled massive handouts to some of their key constituencies, like labor unions. They've chosen to impose socialist price controls on prescription drugs, which will stifle medical innovation and prevent new life-saving cures from being discovered. And perhaps worst of all, they raise taxes on the middle class. I know President Biden promised time and time again to never raise taxes on anyone earning less than $400,000 a year. And our Democratic colleagues still claim that this bill makes good on that promise. But that's simply not consistent with the facts. It's not true. The Nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation has confirmed it. The JCT found that taxpayers making far less than $400,000 at some point get walloped by higher taxes. That includes people making between $30,000 and $40,000 a year. You can read it yourself, the distributional tables at the Joint Committee on Taxation website. We know that inflation is outpacing wage growth, which means that workers already are receiving a silent pay cut or silent tax thanks to overspending here on things that frankly are not priorities. And many of those same workers are going to pay even more in federal taxes. But perhaps the most insulting part of this reckless tax and spending bill that our Democratic colleagues decided to pass unilaterally was they chose to call it the Inflation Reduction Act. Leading economic experts say this bill won't do a thing to address inflation, certainly in the near term. In fact, over the next couple of years, they predict inflation is likely to get slightly worse. But that's how things work in this parallel universe known as Washington, D.C. Democrats see that families are being battered by inflation, but they don't actually pass legislation that will help. Our colleagues just want to use the plight to come up with a sympathetic title for a radical partisan bill. And they're happy to stick middle-class Americans with the check. The icing on the cake came a couple of weeks ago after this bill became law when President Biden made an executive decision to cancel $500 billion in student loans. Any family knows you can't just cancel debt. There's no magic wand that will make it disappear. Every dollar that was borrowed will eventually have to be paid back by someone, but President Biden has just shifted the burden of who that someone will be. Now the middle class taxpayers are on the hook yet once again. Under President Biden's proposal, it doesn't matter if a person took out loans and repaid them already, in other words, did what they said they would do by repaying the money that they had borrowed, whether they worked their way through school, whether they held 2 or 3 jobs, or chose not to attend college at all. Their tax dollars will pay for someone else's college debt. My point, Mr. President, is there is a remarkable divide between what Washington Democrats are trying to accomplish and the problems middle-class families are actually facing. Families are struggling to put food on the table, and our Democratic colleagues are spending hundreds of billions of dollars on climate initiatives. This reminds me of a few years ago, a social movement by the so-called Yellow Jackets, a mosaic of French working class people who felt disenfranchised from the urban elite, who, as they said, can focus on the end of the world while we're worrying about the end of the month. That's what average working families in Texas and across the country are concerned about. How do we get to the end of the month with enough money to put food on the table and gas in the tank? Workers can't afford a full tank of gas, and Democrats are forcing them to subsidize electric vehicles for the wealthy. People are worried about how much their electricity bills will cost this winter, and Democrats imposed a new tax that will send those costs even higher. These policies aren't going to make life better for the middle class anytime soon. They aren't going to help families or businesses that are trying to create jobs and opportunities for their communities, and it certainly isn't going to bring our economy roaring back to life. The fact of the matter is, since our Democrats took control of the government more than a year and a half ago, Texans' lives have gotten harder, not easier. Inflation has skyrocketed, wages have fallen, our economy fell into a recession, and the border's on fire. And our colleagues, certainly the Biden administration, doesn't seem to care. In fact, they seem to block out the concerns of middle-class Americans so they can pursue an ideological agenda like there's no tomorrow. When I'm home in Texas, folks talk about the problems workers and families are facing every day. They don't want to send taxpayer handouts to wealthy people buying electric vehicles, or help subsidize labor unions, or pay off someone else's loans. The sooner our Democratic colleagues realize that, the better off we will all be. But then again, maybe it's going to take an election this November. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I'd note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.